Before the world knew Tony Soprano or Michael Corleone, before John Gotti was flashing his silk suits and defying the law with a smirk, one man ruled the underworld with an iron fist. His name was Al Capone. And unlike the Hollywood mobsters that came after him, Capone's power was real. His empire was built on blood, his fortune made in vice, and his fall, like every great kingpin, was inevitable. But his story wasn't just his own. It was the blueprint for the Mafia legends that followed. Every crime family that came after him, every gangster who dreamed of power, studied Capone's rise and feared his fall. Alphonse Gabriel Capone wasn't born into power. He wasn't the son of a Mafia don, and he didn't inherit an empire. He was the child of poor Italian immigrants, born in Brooklyn in 1899. His father was a barber. His mother was a seamstress. Respectable, hard-working people. But respectability wasn't enough to survive in the streets of New York. Capone grew up surrounded by poverty, crime, and men who made their own rules. He wasn't an instant gangster. At first, he was just another street kid trying to carve out a place in the world. But Al Capone was different. He wasn't just another thug looking for trouble. He was smart, observant, and more than anything else, ambitious. He knew that in the underworld, strength wasn't enough. You had to be ruthless, you had to be strategic, and most importantly, you had to be feared. By the time Capone was a teenager, he had already caught the eye of the men who ran the streets. He wasn't some mindless enforcer. They saw potential in him. A young kid with a sharp mind and no hesitation to use violence when necessary. One of the first men to mentor him was Johnny Torrio, a seasoned gangster who believed in running crime like a business. Not like the reckless street gangs that spilled blood for nothing, but like a corporation, one that could expand, dominate, and most importantly, control the flow of money. Torrio saw something in Capone, and Capone saw an opportunity. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had moved to Chicago at Torrio's request, stepping into a world that would soon be his own. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city on fire. Prohibition had just gone into effect, and with it, an opportunity that would create some of the most powerful criminals in history. The government had handed organized crime a golden ticket, illegal alcohol, and Capone understood something that most others didn't. The key to power wasn't just selling booze. It was controlling every piece of the puzzle. The suppliers, the distributors, the politicians who could turn a blind eye, the police who could be paid off, and the killers who could remove any obstacles in the way. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone helped turn bootlegging into an empire. Speakeasies popped up all over Chicago, illegal breweries churned out alcohol by the gallon, and anyone who tried to interfere, whether it was a rival gang, a nosy journalist, or even a police officer who couldn't be bought, was met with a level of violence that hadn't been seen before. But in 1925, everything changed. Torrio was ambushed and nearly killed in an assassination attempt by a rival gang. He survived, but he saw the writing on the wall. He was getting older, and Chicago was getting more dangerous. So he did something that no one expected. He stepped down. And in his place, he left Al Capone. A man who wasn't just ready to take control, he was eager for it. And unlike Torrio, Capone didn't believe in staying in the shadows. He didn't want to be a silent king, operating in secrecy. He wanted to rule with an open hand, to be known, to be feared. And that's exactly what he did. He moved into a lavish hotel suite at the Lexington Hotel, dressing in expensive suits, riding in armored cars, and publicly flaunting his wealth like a king in broad daylight. He threw extravagant parties, handed out money to the poor, and cultivated an image that made him untouchable. To the public, he was a larger-than-life figure. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. Under Capone, the Chicago outfit became the most powerful crime syndicate in the country. He controlled the flow of alcohol, the police force, the politicians, and even the press. He wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution. But power like that doesn't go unnoticed. And it doesn't last forever. Because behind the luxury, behind the headlines calling him public enemy number one, there was a war brewing. Rival gangs weren't just willing to sit back and let Capone take over. The police weren't going to keep looking the other way forever. And the federal government? They had started watching. They had started taking notes. And Capone, no matter how powerful he seemed, was about to learn the hard way. Every empire, no matter how strong, eventually collapses. But what he left behind, that was something else entirely. Because Capone didn't just rule Chicago, he changed the game. Every crime family that came after him, from the Gambinos to the Genovese, from Lucky Luciano to John Gotti, learned from Capone. His tactics, his violence, his rise and his downfall became the lessons that every future gangster would study. Capone wasn't just a crime boss, he was the blueprint for the American Mafia, and the world would never be the same again. Power in the underworld isn't taken with words. It isn't earned through diplomacy. It is seized through blood, through fear, and through the absolute certainty that crossing the wrong man means death. And in Al Capone's Chicago, there was no question who that wrong man was. From the moment Capone took control of the Chicago outfit, the city was no longer a battleground. It was his empire. But an empire isn't built without war. And Capone's war was unlike anything America had seen before. At the time, Chicago wasn't just home to one gang. It was a chessboard of criminal organizations fighting for control of bootlegging routes, speakeasies, gambling operations, and political influence. The North Side Gang, led by the cunning and ruthless Dean O'Banion, controlled much of the illegal alcohol trade before Capone's rise. They were Irish, fearless, and unwilling to step aside for the up-and-coming Italian syndicate that Capone represented. In 1924, tensions exploded. O'Banion had humiliated Johnny Torrio, Capone's mentor, by tricking him into buying a brewery right before a police raid. It was a move that couldn't be ignored. And in the world of organized crime, there was only one answer to betrayal. On November 10, 1924, O'Banion was gunned down inside his flower shop. The hit was carried out with cold precision: 3 men, 2 handshakes, 6 bullets. It was a message: the Chicago outfit would not be played. But if Capone and Torrio thought the war was over, they were wrong. O'Banion's death set off a chain reaction of revenge killings that would turn Chicago into a war zone. His successor, Jaime Weiss, launched relentless attacks on Torrio and Capone's operations, including a brutal ambush outside Torrio's home that nearly ended his life. Torrio barely survived, and when he did, he made a decision that changed history. He retired, handing full control to Capone. And Capone? He didn't just continue the fight, he escalated it. Unlike Torrio, who believed in keeping violence in the shadows, Capone turned Chicago into a battlefield. Drive-by shootings, bombings, assassinations. There were no limits. The North Side Gang struck first, unleashing a storm of bullets on Capone's headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero. But Capone, protected by his bulletproof Cadillac and an army of gunmen, refused to be taken down. Instead, he responded with a level of brutality that would cement his reputation forever. On February 14, 1929, a cold morning in a quiet garage on Clark Street, Capone sent a message that no one would forget. 7 members of the North Side Gang were lined up against a wall, disarmed, and executed in one of the most infamous mob hits in history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The killers were disguised as police officers. The victims never stood a chance. When the gunfire stopped, the garage was covered in blood. The bodies lay slumped, riddled with over 70 bullets. It was not just a hit, it was a statement, a declaration that Capone was the undisputed king of Chicago. But the massacre, brutal as it was, came with a cost. For years, Capone had controlled Chicago through a combination of fear, corruption, and calculated generosity. He kept the politicians paid, the police in his pocket, and the public entertained. To many, he wasn't just a crime boss, he was a celebrity. A man who threw lavish parties, handed out Christmas turkeys to the poor, and lived the kind of life that ordinary men could only dream of. But the St. Valentine's Day Massacre changed that. It was too public, too ruthless. It wasn't just another gang killing, it was a massacre that shocked the nation. Newspapers ran the photos, showing the bodies piled up like discarded trash. The myth of Capone as a charming outlaw began to crack, replaced by something darker, something the government could no longer ignore. Capone had won the war, but for the first time he had drawn too much attention, and in the shadows, the law was watching, preparing, waiting. Because even the most untouchable men make mistakes, and Capone's downfall had already begun. Capone didn't invent organized crime. He wasn't the first man to bribe a politician, hijack a shipment, or silence a rival with a bullet. But what he did, what no one before him had done, was take the chaos of the underworld and mold it into a machine, a system, a blueprint that crime families across the country would study, refine, and perfect for decades to come. Before Capone, crime in America was fragmented. Gangs fought over scraps, operating more like street thugs than businessmen. Power shifted with every gunshot, and alliances were as fragile as the next betrayal. But Capone understood something that his predecessors did not. Crime, real crime, wasn't about short-term gains. It was about control, structure, organization. Capone's empire was not just a gang, it was an institution. At the top, there was the boss, Capone himself. He made the decisions, controlled the money, and issued the orders that shaped Chicago's underworld. Beneath him was the underboss, his right-hand man, responsible for carrying out Capone's will and keeping the machine running smoothly. Then came the capos, trusted lieutenants who managed different parts of the empire. Some oversaw the breweries that pumped out illegal alcohol by the barrel. Others ran the speakeasies, ensuring that every glass of whiskey poured in Chicago had Capone's fingerprints on it. Some handled the gambling dens, the brothels, or the extortion rackets that kept businesses in line. At the bottom were the soldiers, the enforcers, the hitmen, the men who made sure that debts were paid and silence was kept. And behind it all, pulling the strings in the background, were the fixers, corrupt politicians, judges, and police officers who ensured that Capone's empire remained untouchable. This structure was not just effective, it was revolutionary. Capone didn't just rely on brute force. He understood that power was about influence. He had Chicago's mayor in his pocket. He had judges who would dismiss charges before they ever reached a courtroom. He had entire police precincts who knew better than to interfere with his business. It was a level of control that made him more than just a criminal. It made him a king. And future crime families took notice. The five families of New York, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, would later adopt a similar structure, refining it into what would become known as La Cosa Nostra. Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history, would take Capone's system and expand it into a nationwide criminal syndicate. Even John Gotti, decades later, followed the same model. A boss at the top, a network of enforcers below, corruption at every level. Capone's playbook, rewritten with a new cast of players. But Capone's influence wasn't just in the structure of the Mafia, it was in the mentality. Before Capone, gangsters hid in the shadows. They operated in secrecy, avoiding the public eye. But Capone changed that. He became a celebrity gangster, flaunting his power, living like a king, walking openly among the people he ruled. John Gotti would later do the same, earning the nickname the Dapper Don for his expensive suits and public appearances. He embraced the media, just like Capone had. He wanted to be seen, feared, admired. Capone's reign in Chicago was brutal. But it was also a lesson. A lesson that crime, when done correctly, was not just about violence. It was about control, about creating a machine so powerful that even the law struggled to dismantle it. But Capone made one mistake, a mistake that every crime boss after him would study. He believed he was invincible. And invincible men don't watch their backs. Capone's empire was running at full force. But in the corridors of power, far from the speakeasies and backroom deals, the government was planning something that no amount of bribery or bullets could stop. Because while Capone had built an empire, he had also left a trail of numbers. And in the end, it wasn't the rival gangs or the bullets that brought him down. It was a ledger, a single piece of paper, and the men who knew how to read it. Decades after Capone's empire crumbled, a new generation of gangsters studied his legacy. They read about his rise, his power, and most importantly, his mistakes. And no one studied Capone more closely than John Gotti, the man who would become the most infamous crime boss of the 20th century, the last of the Mafia's public kings, the real-life Tony Soprano, and the man who, just like Capone, would meet his downfall in the most unexpected way. John Gotti was born in 1940, long after Capone's reign ended. But in the streets of New York, Capone's name was still legend. The older mobsters, the ones who had lived through Capone's era, spoke of him with a mix of respect and caution. He had built something no one thought possible, and yet he had fallen. Gotti listened, he learned, and when his time came, he took Capone's playbook and rewrote it for a new era. Much like Capone, Gotti understood that fear alone wasn't enough to hold power. He had to be seen, respected, admired. The old Mafia bosses, men like Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, believed in staying in the shadows. They ran their operations quietly, avoiding media attention. But Gotti? He embraced the spotlight just as Capone had. He wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and walked the streets of New York like a king. The newspapers called him the Dapper Don. The public loved him. He tipped waiters with $100 bills. He smiled for cameras outside courtrooms. He threw lavish parties and paraded through the city as if he were untouchable. And in many ways he was. Just like Capone, Gotti controlled everything: bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking. And just like Capone, he used violence as both a weapon and a message. When he wanted something, he took it. When someone crossed him, they disappeared. But Gotti's real power came from his reputation. People feared him. And in the Mafia, fear is currency. He idolized Capone's ability to manipulate the media, to build a larger-than-life persona that made him seem invincible. Gotti, like Capone, wanted to be more than a gangster. He wanted to be a legend. But legends don't last forever. Capone's mistake had been arrogance. He thought he could operate in plain sight without consequences. And Gotti? He made the same miscalculation. For years, the FBI had tried to take Gotti down, just as they had with Capone. Wiretaps, informants, undercover agents, nothing stuck. Witnesses refused to testify. Judges were intimidated. Prosecutors failed case after case. The newspapers started calling him the Teflon Don because no charge would stick. But just like Capone, Gotti's downfall wasn't brought by bullets or gang wars. It came from within. His own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, turned against him. The man who had once been Gotti's most loyal enforcer became the government's star witness, testifying against him in court. Capone had fallen because of tax evasion. Gotti fell because of betrayal. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison, spending the rest of his days in a solitary cell, locked away from the world he had once ruled. The lesson was clear. Capone had been the blueprint. Gotti had been the last man to try and follow it. And after Gotti fell, the Mafia changed forever. No more public bosses, no more larger-than-life figures walking the streets. The new generation of gangsters learned from Capone and Gotti's mistakes. They went back to the shadows. Because in the end, history had proven one thing. The moment a gangster becomes a celebrity, his days are numbered. Crime is real. Blood is real. The bodies that piled up in Capone's Chicago were real. But for the world outside the underworld, Capone became something more. He became a story, a legend, a myth so intoxicating that Hollywood couldn't look away. And from the moment the camera started rolling, America's love affair with the gangster was born. Capone wasn't just a criminal. He was a character, larger than life, made for the screen. His suits, his swagger, his ability to command a room with a single look, it was the kind of villainy that Hollywood dreamt of. And almost as soon as his empire crumbled, his story was repackaged and sold to the masses. The first wave of gangster films hit the theaters in the 1930s, just as Capone was fading from the public eye. Little Caesar, 1931, starring Edward G. Robinson, followed the rise and fall of a brutal mobster, a character heavily inspired by Capone. Scarface, 1932, directed by Howard Hawks, took the inspiration even further, crafting a ruthless gangster named Tony Camonte, a thinly disguised version of Capone himself. The film was so blatant that authorities pressured the studio to add a disclaimer, distancing the movie from real events. But the public wasn't fooled. They knew who the film was really about. Capone had spent years manipulating his own image, making himself larger than life. Hollywood simply took what he had built and gave it back to the world. Decades later, the cycle repeated. In 1983, Brian De Palma's Scarface reimagined the story for a new generation. This time, Al Pacino's Tony Montana was the face of excess, ruthless, violent, untouchable, until he wasn't. The film became an instant classic, but its roots were still tied to the original Capone myth. Then came The Untouchables, 1987, a film that turned Capone's downfall into a cinematic epic. Robert De Niro, playing Capone, captured both the charisma and the menace that had made the real man so dangerous. His scenes, beating a man to death with a baseball bat, taunting Elliot Ness, ruling his empire from a throne-like chair, were unforgettable. And Hollywood wasn't done. HBO's Boardwalk Empire painted a vivid picture of the Prohibition era, placing Capone in the midst of a larger, more intricate world of crime and politics. Films like Public Enemies, 2009, and Capone, 2020, continued the tradition, each new portrayal adding layers to the legend. But Capone's influence didn't stop at biopics. It seeped into every corner of pop culture. When David Chase created The Sopranos, he built his main character, Tony Soprano, in the image of the old-school gangsters, the same ones who had studied Capone's rise and fall. The arrogance, the temper, the struggle to balance family and crime, it was all there. And then there was Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, a film that took the structure Capone had built and transformed it into the Mafia's ultimate cinematic legacy. The Corleone family wasn't just inspired by real crime families, they were a reflection of Capone's empire, with Marlon Brando's Don Vito Corleone embodying the kind of power and influence Capone had wielded in his prime. Even John Gotti, who saw himself as the modern-day Capone, was said to have watched The Godfather religiously, using it as a guide for how a boss should carry himself. But while Hollywood loved Capone, it also cemented the one truth every gangster would eventually face. Every story, no matter how legendary, ends the same way. The rise is always thrilling, the power is intoxicating. But the fall? It's inevitable. And Capone, for all his cunning, could not escape the fate that awaited him. Because no matter how powerful a man is, no matter how many men fear him, no matter how high he climbs, history is undefeated. And Capone's final chapter had already begun. For years, Capone had played the game better than anyone. He had bribed judges, owned politicians, and kept the police in his pocket. He ruled Chicago not just with bullets, but with influence. And as far as he was concerned, he was untouchable. But power makes men reckless. And the higher they rise, the harder they fall. Capone was about to learn that lesson the hard way. By the late 1920s, Capone had reached the peak of his empire. His network of bootlegging, gambling, and extortion raked in an estimated $100 million a year, the equivalent of over $1.5 billion today. He was the undisputed king of Chicago. But his rule had come at a cost. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 had been his boldest move yet. 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a garage wall and gunned down, executed by men dressed as police officers. The message was clear. There was no room for challengers in Capone's Chicago. But there was one problem. This time, the violence couldn't be ignored. The massacre shocked the nation. Newspapers branded Capone as public enemy number 1. Politicians who had once taken his money now saw him as a liability. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, was under pressure to bring him down. The problem? Capone had been careful. There were no fingerprints tying him to the murders, no witnesses willing to testify. And so the government changed tactics. They stopped trying to catch Capone the gangster. Instead, they went after Capone, the businessman. The man who had built an empire had also built something far more dangerous, a paper trail. The tax evasion trap. It wasn't the bloodshed, it wasn't the bribes, it wasn't the bootlegging. In the end, Capone was taken down by something as mundane as an unpaid tax bill. Elliot Ness, a young and relentless federal agent, was given the job of crippling Capone's empire. His team, later known as the Untouchables, was one of the few law enforcement groups that couldn't be bought. They raided breweries, seized trucks, and disrupted Capone's supply lines. But the real damage wasn't done by Ness, it was done by an accountant. Frank J. Wilson, an investigator for the Treasury Department, had been quietly following Capone's money. And what he found was damning. Capone lived like a king. Expensive suits, luxury cars, lavish parties. He had mansions, private chefs, and enough wealth to make legitimate businessmen jealous. But there was one problem. He had never filed a tax return. The U.S. government didn't need to prove that Capone had ordered murders. They didn't need to prove that he ran an empire of crime. All they needed was to prove that he had earned millions and paid nothing. In 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. At first, he laughed it off. He had beaten every charge before. He had bribed jurors, intimidated witnesses, and walked out of courtrooms untouched. But this time, The government was ready. At the last moment, the judge switched the jury with an entirely new panel, one that hadn't been bought. Capone's smirk disappeared. The trial lasted 11 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, ledgers, and financial records all pointed to the same conclusion. Capone had made millions and paid nothing. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came down. Guilty. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the longest tax evasion sentence in U.S. history at the time. The King of Chicago had fallen, the slow death of Al Capone. Prison was not just a punishment, it was a death sentence. Capone was sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary, where his power vanished overnight. Guards didn't take bribes, fellow inmates didn't fear him, and worst of all, his health began to deteriorate. By 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz, America's most notorious prison. Cut off from his empire, isolated from his allies, Capone faded into irrelevance. The man who had once commanded an army of killers now spent his days in a cell, broken and forgotten. But the final blow wasn't prison. It was disease. Years of untreated syphilis had begun eating away at his brain. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shadow of the man he had once been. He spent his final years in Florida, paranoid, confused, and mentally deteriorated. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of a heart attack. The man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist was buried in an unremarkable grave. But his story? That would never die. Because while Capone had been destroyed, his blueprint for crime had not. The structure he built, the tactics he used, the legend he left behind, those would live on. In the Mafia, in Hollywood, and in the minds of every criminal who dared to dream of becoming the next Al Capone. Death ends a man, but a legend never dies. Capone's empire was dismantled. His body was buried. His name, however, would echo through history, etched into the foundation of organized crime and immortalized in pop culture. What Capone built was more than an empire. It was a blueprint, a roadmap that crime lords, real and fictional, would follow for generations. The Mafia learns from Capone. Al Capone's reign was both a triumph and a warning. He had built his kingdom with violence, intimidation, and absolute control, but he had also made himself too visible. For the next generation of mob bosses, his story became a lesson in what to do and what to avoid. When the five families of New York rose to power, they studied Capone's mistakes. Men like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky understood that ruling from the shadows was the only way to ensure survival. Luciano's solution? The Commission, a governing body for the Mafia, designed to prevent the kind of reckless wars that had drawn so much heat to Capone. Instead of one man standing as an untouchable king, power was distributed. Decisions were made quietly. The violence never disappeared, but it became controlled, calculated. But not every mobster followed that philosophy. Some couldn't resist the spotlight, just like Capone. John Gotti saw himself as the modern-day Capone, flaunting his power for the world to see. He basked in the media attention, believing he was invincible. And just like Capone, he paid the price for it, betrayed from within, locked away, and left to die behind bars. The Mafia learned the truth Capone had failed to see. The moment you become a celebrity, you become a target. Capone's influence on pop culture. If Capone had been just another gangster, his name would have faded into history. But he wasn't just a gangster, he was a myth. A character too compelling for Hollywood to ignore. His story became the foundation of the gangster film genre, inspiring characters that defined American cinema. Every fictional crime boss, every ruthless kingpin, every larger-than-life villain owes something to Capone. Tony Montana, Scarface, 1983. A Cuban immigrant who rises to power through blood and ambition. His downfall? Arrogance, paranoia, a refusal to step back. Tony Soprano, The Sopranos, 1999 to 2007. A mob boss struggling to balance crime with family. A man whose own personality flaws pull him deeper into destruction. Vito Corleone, The Godfather, 1972. A powerful but wise leader, representing the Mafia's evolution from Capone's brute force rule to a system built on quiet control. Even in video games, Capone's legacy lived on. Titles like Grand Theft Auto were drenched in his influence, allowing players to build criminal empires, just as Capone had. And then, there were the countless documentaries, books, and TV series that kept his name alive. Even decades after his death, people still asked, What made Al Capone so fascinating? The answer? Capone wasn't just a gangster. He was the first gangster the world couldn't look away from. The legacy of power and paranoia. Capone built an empire. Capone lost an empire. But the story never ended there. His name became synonymous with organized crime itself, a symbol of absolute power and inevitable downfall. Because no matter how much money a man makes, no matter how much fear he inspires, history always catches up. Capone wasn't the first mobster to rise to power, and he wouldn't be the last to fall. But in the end, he was something more. A warning, a legend, and a name that, nearly a century later, still refuses to be forgotten. Capone died in 1947, but his name never did. Decades later, his blueprint still lingers in the minds of criminals who dream of ruling the underworld. His methods, power through fear, bribery over bullets, the illusion of invincibility, still shape the way crime is conducted. But just like Capone, every criminal who has followed his path has faced the same unavoidable truth: no empire lasts forever. The Capone playbook, alive and well. Even long after Prohibition, organized crime figures across the world have borrowed from Capone's strategies to build their own empires. In the 1970s and 80s, the American Mafia still followed the structure that Capone had pioneered, controlling entire cities, shaking down businesses, and paying off officials to look the other way. The Gambino family, under John Gotti, used the media just like Capone had, turning Gotti into a celebrity gangster. His designer suits, public persona, and belief in his own untouchability mirrored Capone's rise, and his eventual fall was just as spectacular. The Mexican cartels studied Capone's methods, refining them for an era where drug trafficking replaced bootlegging. Like Capone, they used extreme violence to eliminate rivals while still maintaining political connections. And just like Capone, their leaders, men like El Chapo, eventually fell because of their own arrogance, their own visibility, and their own belief that they could outsmart the system forever. Even outside the Mafia and cartels, Capone's name still carries weight. Street gangs, corrupt businessmen, and even cybercriminals reference his philosophy of power, that a mix of intimidation and charm can get you further than raw violence alone. But Capone's most lasting lesson? The moment you think you're bigger than the law, the countdown begins. Capone's name in today's headlines. Even today, his name keeps showing up, used by criminals trying to link themselves to his legend. In 2021, a massive criminal operation in Italy was dubbed Operation Al Capone, after authorities uncovered a money-laundering empire modeled after his financial schemes. In Chicago, some gang leaders still invoke Capone's name, seeing themselves as his successors, despite the fact that Capone's empire has been dead for almost a century. Even in pop culture, rappers and celebrities reference Capone, using his name as a symbol of wealth and dominance, despite the fact that he died penniless and broken. His name has been mythologized, twisted, and repurposed. But one thing remains true: no one who has tried to be the next Capone has ever lasted. The curse of Capone's path. Capone believed he was invincible. He wasn't. Gotti believed he was too powerful to be touched. He was wrong. El Chapo thought he could keep escaping. Now he's in a cell for life. Every criminal who tries to follow Capone's path learns the same lesson. The end is always the same. Capone's story isn't just a tale of power. It's a cautionary tale, one that plays out over and over again from the streets of Chicago to the corridors of drug empires across the world. Because crime, no matter how lucrative, always has an expiration date. And the men who refuse to accept that truth, they end up just like Capone, forgotten, isolated, and buried in an unmarked grave. A man like Capone doesn't just disappear. He may have died in 1947, but some say he never truly left. His name still echoes through the halls of his old hideouts. His spirit, some believe, lingers in the places where he once ruled. And for those who dare to walk in his footsteps, one thing is certain: Capone's presence has never faded. The haunting of Alcatraz. After his conviction, Capone was sent to Alcatraz, America's most infamous prison. It was meant to break the worst criminals, isolated on an island, stripped of power, and left to rot. But for Capone, it wasn't just the prison walls that tormented him. He was afraid of something no one else could see. By the time he arrived, syphilis had already begun attacking his brain. He started talking to himself, mumbling in the darkness of his cell. Guards reported hearing him plead for mercy, not from them, but from someone he claimed was haunting him, Jimmy Clark. Clark had been one of the men executed in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, gunned down under Capone's orders. And now, Capone believed his ghost had come for revenge. The guards dismissed it as delirium, but other prisoners heard it too. "Someone is in there with him," one inmate whispered. The sound of Capone screaming at an unseen visitor, begging to be left alone, continued for years. By the time he left Alcatraz, his mind was nearly gone. But some say his torment never ended. Even today, visitors to Alcatraz report hearing Capone's voice, a ghostly murmur echoing through the abandoned cells. Some claim to hear the faint sound of a banjo, the instrument Capone played to pass the time in prison. A sound that, according to legend, never truly stopped. Capone's old haunts, still alive with his presence. But Alcatraz isn't the only place where Capone's spirit refuses to rest. The Lexington Hotel, Chicago, Capone's old headquarters, once filled with hidden tunnels and secret rooms. Staff and guests claim to hear footsteps, whispers, and even the smell of cigar smoke long after Capone was gone. The Congress Plaza Hotel, the place where Capone conducted business during Prohibition. Some visitors have seen a shadowy figure dressed in a suit standing near the bar, then vanishing without a trace. Miami Mansion, Capone's final home where he died a broken man. Strange noises, objects moving on their own, and sightings of a pale figure staring out from the windows have been reported. The mystery of Capone's missing fortune. Capone was a billionaire by today's standards, but when he died, his fortune was nowhere to be found. Despite making over $100 million a year during his reign, Capone left behind almost nothing. His family lived modestly. His bank accounts were nearly empty. So where did the money go? Some believe he hid it away, stashing cash in underground vaults before his arrest. In 1986, Geraldo Rivera led a televised excavation of one of Capone's supposed vaults beneath the Lexington Hotel. Millions tuned in, expecting to see mountains of gold, money, or even bodies. When the doors were finally opened, nothing. Just dust, broken bottles, and silence. But the legend of Capone's lost fortune hasn't died. Treasure hunters still search for it, believing that somewhere, in a hidden tunnel beneath a forgotten building, Capone's wealth is still waiting to be found. Capone's name, a curse or a warning. Some names are meant to be remembered, others are meant to be feared. Capone's legacy is one of power, crime, and destruction. But for those who invoke his name, there's a pattern. They never last. Gangsters who claim to be his successor, they fall. Criminals who mimic his arrogance, they disappear. Even those who dare to use his name in business often find their luck turning against them. Because Capone's legacy isn't just about crime. It's about the inevitable fate of every man who thinks he's untouchable. A fate that, like his ghost, never stops lurking. Legends fade, kingdoms crumble, but some names refuse to die. Al Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was a symbol, a warning, a myth that shaped the very idea of organized crime. Decades after his death, his story is still being told, his name is still being whispered, and his influence is still being felt. The paradox of Capone's legacy. Capone's empire was built on violence, corruption, and absolute control. But his legacy, it became something far more complicated. To some, he was a criminal mastermind, a ruthless businessman who ruled with an iron fist. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man who climbed too high too fast, only to lose everything in the end. And to the public, he became a pop culture icon, the face of the American gangster, a character larger than life. Capone inspired Hollywood, shaped the Mafia, and influenced criminals for generations. But in the end, his greatest lesson was this: power never lasts. The bigger the empire, the harder the fall. The inevitable fate of every crime boss. Capone's story has played out again and again in the decades since his death. The mafia bosses who followed him, dead, imprisoned, or forgotten. The drug lords who mimicked his rule, hunted down, betrayed by their own men. Even the politicians and businessmen who operate in the shadows, they all meet the same fate eventually. Capone's rise was legendary. But his fall? It was inevitable, because no man is bigger than history. Why Al Capone will never be forgotten. A man can be killed, a name can be erased, but a legend outlives them all. Capone's face still appears in movies, books, and TV shows. His name still lingers in the streets he once ruled. His story still captivates new generations, people who never met him, never lived through his reign, yet still feel his presence in history. Some call him a monster. Some call him a genius. But one thing is certain, the world will never stop talking about Al Capone. And if you want more stories like this, untold histories, crime legends, and the real stories behind the myths, subscribe to this channel now. There's always another legend waiting to be uncovered, and you don't want to miss it.